President Obama, while not exactly yelling, indicating that he does identify with the 99%, announcing a plan today at the University of Colorado to cap federal student loan repayments at 10% of discretionary income and forgive the debt therein after 20 years instead of after 25. He also told the students he sympathizes with their situation because he and the First Lady have been there.
Look, obviously we were lucky to have gotten a great education. We were able to land good jobs with a steady income, but it still took us almost 10 years to finally pay off all our student debt. Keep in mind, college isn't just one of the best investments you can make in your future, it's one of the best investments America can make in our future. So we want you in school. We want you in school. But we shouldn't saddle you with debt when you're starting off.
Joining us now, the economist Robert Reich, former Labor Secretary, author of Aftershock, The Next Economy and America's Future. Thanks for your time tonight, sir.
Good evening, Keith.
The loan plan, no vote in Congress. How does he do that, and what impact do you expect that this will have?
Well, the president is trying a number of options that are basically steps in the right direction, not very large. The student loan plan that he unveiled today is a step in the right direction. It does allow students to consolidate their loans and also, as you said, to put a cap on the kind of the paybacks they have to make in any given year. That's a huge help to students, but it is a step in this. It's a small step in the right direction because there's still a huge load of student debt, and a lot of students can't even get jobs these days. What he did yesterday in terms of housing, again, a step in the right direction, but without legislation, without Republicans willing to cooperate on anything, he's not really going to be able to do very much.
To that end, you wrote that Obama should demand that the Glass-Steagall Act be resurrected and the big banks be broken up. Is there any chance that he might decide, however perhaps quixotic that might be at the moment, that given the energy that the Occupy movement would provide him and some political cover, at least at the far left, that he should at least attempt that?
Well, it's not just the Occupy movement. It's also the fact that the Volcker Rule, which was basically supposed to keep commercial and investment banking separate, has been basically whittled to death by Wall Street in terms of their lobbyists over the last year. And what came out a couple of days ago was a 300-page piece of just kind of moronic prose. If you got a chance to read it, I actually struggled through it for several hours. It's just exemptions and loopholes for Wall Street. And if that's the way Wall Street is going to react to regulation, then I think the president does have to step up and say, we've got to go back to Glass-Steagall. We've also got to break up the big banks, because look what you have rendered. Look what the big banks have done. Look what the suffering is of Americans. And I think also, although the Occupy movement, Keith, is still a very small tip of an iceberg, there is a big iceberg of discontent, of anger, of stress. People look at CEO salaries that are now 350 times the salary of the average worker. They look at the profits that are being raked in by big corporations and by Wall Street, and they say, wait a minute, what happened to us? We are getting on the short end of the stick. Our incomes are going down. We're underwater. 1 out of 4 of us who has a mortgage are underwater. We're losing our jobs. You know, this economy was supposed to be for everybody.
And we saw what the Congressional Office came out with about the trebling of the top 1%'s income since 1979, as opposed to almost no change for everybody else. But your point about the reaction in Wall Street, there's another part of this story, the Bank of America CEO who claims that it's the bankers who are being unfairly attacked, right after it was revealed that his company was engaged in dealings that you've argued are illegal under the new financial regulations. And I know Marie Antoinette never said, let them eat cake, but how foolish does Brian Moynihan have to be, and how representative is he to have said, think a little about that before you start yelling at us?
Well, look, these people, Jamie Dimon, other CEOs on Wall Street, they live in a very insular world. I mean, I don't think they frankly know what is going on in the rest of the country. I don't think they have any sense of the degree of anger and upset and stress that most Americans have experienced since the bubble burst and since Wall Street's excesses became the center focus of everybody's attention. I mean, the bailout of Wall Street also began, a lot of us forget, also began the Tea Party movement. Right. I mean, Americans, it's not that the Tea Party and occupiers are the same; they're very different. But there's a common thread of kind of we're fed up You know, this economy is working for a small, narrow group at the top and not for all of us. And there are ways of getting the economy back, Keith. I mean, the economy is supposed to work for us, not the other way around.
The president never mentioned Occupy Wall Street. Did he have to? Have his actions this week and of late been inspired by or impelled by or just speeded up by Occupy?
I don't think he has to mention it. I do think, though, that it has to be in his head. You know, I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago, and I have to go there every once in a while. And, Keith, the interesting thing is Occupy Wall Street has already had a huge success because the tenor of debate in Washington among Republicans and Democrats and other people I met with, people were talking about inequality. They were talking about wealth and income going to the top. They were talking about the fact that so many Americans see the power of money in politics and are so disillusioned with politics because there is so much money coming from the top in politics. You know, this is kind of talk that I haven't witnessed in years in Washington. And so I say to people who are on the streets and people who are being gassed in Oakland, California, and around the country, I say, look, you're already having an effect.
Indeed.
Be patient.
Indeed.
Keep at it.
A few years after the end of World War I, Congress passed a law saying that veterans of that war were entitled to a bonus for their service. In 1924, Congress said American veterans of the First World War had earned a bonus of $1,000. But here's the catch. It could not be paid for about 20 more years. They couldn't collect it until 1945, or their families could collect it upon their death if that came before 1945. Well, along the way, the country fell into the Great Depression. Americans were starving to death. They were on bread lines. And the veterans who knew that $1,000 was owed to them by the government decided that they would much rather collect that now, please. That money was owed to them, they had earned it, and they needed it to feed their families now. So in the spring of 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression, the veterans marched into Washington because they wanted payment of that bonus they had earned in World War I. They were called the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army set up as an encampment in Washington, D.C., tens of thousands of people in a living political protest. History tells us that they kept their instant city clean. They integrated their camp racially, which was really quite radical at the time. We know that they grew gardens for food. They settled in for as long as it might take to make their point to Congress and to then President Herbert Hoover. At least that's what the Bonus Army hoped. The head of the U.S. Army, General Douglas MacArthur, looked out at the peaceful protest of those veterans camping out and saw an embarrassment for his commander-in-chief. MacArthur mustered troops on horseback against the veterans' camp and followed those horses with tanks. The destruction began.
Then troops began to set fire to their wooden shacks. One reporter wrote, "The blaze was so big it lit the whole sky. A nightmare come to life." The president looked out a window of the White House in the direction of the fire, then retired for the night.
And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic Bonus Army that ends so disastrously in the shadow of the capital of the United States of America.
Washington, D.C., 1932, the raid on the Bonus Army. Oakland, California, 2011, the raid on Occupy Oakland, Occupy Wall Street. Two American scenes separated by almost a century. But put the old one in color, throw on some plaid shirts, and you almost could not tell them apart. In his story this week in New York Magazine, Frank Rich tells the story of the Bonus Army and of Occupy Wall Street. He titles it, quote, "The Class War Has Begun." Joining us now for the interview is Frank Rich. Frank, I'm so glad you could be here. Thanks for being here.
I'm delighted to be here, Rachel.
The scenes in Oakland this week were dramatic and upsetting. As we showed earlier tonight, one protester who's a young Iraq war veteran was reportedly seriously wounded in Oakland last night and is hospitalized. Does the use of force against these protests change their political impact?
It seems to. For instance, in New York, when this began, Bloomberg started out, there were some police actions, as we all know, that I think inflamed public opinion, again, sort of as in 1932, in favor of the Occupy Wall Street demonstrators. What happened in Oakland is horrifying, and I think will backfire. And if it's certainly not going to put out this movement, which just seems to be spreading, and whose core issues are gaining in popularity, as the polls you've cited tonight show, by the minute.
The right has been trying, and elected Republicans, but really even more so from the conservative media, has been trying to demonize the protesters. Today, FoxNews.com started to say they were all acorn
Oh,
nice. They brought Acorn back,
Acorn's been
which is
pulled
nice.
back out.
People like the former Fox News host, who now is just on the internet, I guess, Glenn Beck, was saying that these are this is a radical movement designed to destroy the American way of life, describing socialists and Islamists and all these other people. They're being derided as anti-American radicals. Is that what we should expect, or is that something potentially damaging to this?
I don't think it is potentially damaging, but interestingly, it's again what happened with the bonus army during the Depression. There was a lot of theories that they were communists. In fact, someone had the theory they were controlled by Jewish movie producers at MGM. I love that idea. And Secret Service was sent in to infiltrate the bonus army, but they couldn't find communists, or they found a few. What they mainly found were patriotic veterans out of work and desperate at a time, by the way, when again there was the highest income inequality until now. That was the biggest period. In 1928 was the last peak of it, and at a time when Congress had bailed out banks and railroads, set up a new agency under Hoover, and then adjourned for the summer, leaving the bonus army to be routed. So I think it's going to backfire. And I think also that sort of Fox News, Glenn Beck, they're speaking to people who are going to feel this regardless. I think that it's an echo chamber. The polls have been remarkable on this because they keep going up. Obama stayed away from this. Eric Cantor, on the other side, called them mobs when Occupy Wall Street started. Bloomberg was very critical. Then suddenly there was a Wall Street Journal, NBC News poll showing that 37% approved. Every poll since has gone up. Time had a poll, 54% of Americans approved the principles that the protesters are rallying behind. National Journal higher, the Times high, the Times CBS poll. So it keeps building.
There are two things at work here. There is the idea of what they stand for, which is anger at the sort of income inequality we were just talking about, and the sense of unfairness about who's gotten ahead and who's sort of getting away with it. Mm-hmm. And there is also the physical reality of the protest. And I wonder how important you see it is that this is a physical presence, that this is direct action, that this is not just an idea or a movement in concept, but a physical manifestation of this discontent.
Interestingly, I feel it's not always that important. They lit a fire. We live in a world unlike that of 1932, where we have a virtual reality in the form of social networking, different media. Things can move beyond the concrete corporal reality. So I feel, in a sense, if you go down to Zuccotti Park, it's very small. It's much smaller than the encampment of the bonus army, for instance, but it's lit a fire, and now it seems that it's sort of taking off on its own. I've been in Baltimore and Washington in the past 24 hours. They both had encampments. So obviously this is going on all over the place. Oakland's another example. There are many, even in Europe. But in the end, I think when you look at those polls and you see the anger that's out there from people who aren't demonstrating at all, this is something that's building beyond the physical presence of people in tents and protesting.
In seeing the police confrontations, and some of these confrontations are terrifying. And certainly the police say they're being provoked in many cases, denying use of force that is obvious in some cases. Like in Oakland, a lot of these confrontations are very problematic, are very hard to watch. They're upsetting, and people are afraid. That said, I know from early in the protest, and I heard this from being there early in the protest, just going down to watch, people saying things like police are part of the 99% too. I heard people chanting, police need a raise, police need a raise.
Absolutely. Look, there'll always be crazy people and there'll always be provocateurs in any situation in the United States, no matter who it involves, regardless of politics. But I was last at Zuccotti Park on Sunday night, and it was exactly that. And the interchange between the police and the protesters there was completely polite, even when there were disagreements about where they should clear a certain passageway. And a lot of it was just people talking. Yeah. And it was like a teach-in in the 60s, people explaining their ideas, some more sophisticated than others.
That talking, the fact that the conversation has changed to be about this discontent, about this anger, about the sense of unfairness, that change of the discussion, I think, is the biggest impact that we have, that we could hope for, and it's already happened.
It's remarkable to what extent it has.